Okay. Hi, and welcome everybody. So where are we in the course right now? So last week we just did the design doc presentations where you were trying to lay out kind of the blueprints of how your game is going to go so that you have a direction to start focusing as you produce your playable prototype. So as you're doing that, the things we're going to be presenting to you this week are meant to aid in that. On Thursday, we're going to talk a little bit about project management. So how do you take your team and make sure that you're organized so that as you go into reading week, each of you has an idea of what you're going to do and how often you're going to check in and how you can kind of move together as a group. But what we're talking about today is more thinking about the person who's going to play this game and always kind of having that person in mind. We've been talking about, what kind of experience you're going to create. But in terms of thinking of how your player is going to interact with your game, thinking about what kind of experience they're going to have when they play it, that's what today is about, right? And this is the thing that you need to be mindful of as you're making your game, because it's not just about putting together the pieces, but always thinking about kind of your target audience and what kind of things can you do as you're putting this game together to make this experience fun for the person who's playing it. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to today's guest speakers. This is Elaine and Sophia. Both of them have been grad students in our program in the field of HCI and actually have been students of this course a long time ago. How long was it?
Very long ago.
2016.
Wow.
Yeah, because it was when I was gone, right? I was on sabbatical that year. So they were students of the course in 2016 and have made games with me, a few times, I feel like. So they know exactly what it's like to be in your position right now, and the things they're going to say are meant to be advice for you on making sure that your game not only comes together structurally, but also comes together kind of thematically, let's say. All right. With that, I'll hand things over to the two of you. I don't know if you wanted to introduce yourself briefly before you get started, but basically the floor is yours.
Thank you. We have our introduction in the slides, so I will get to it. I guess right now. Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine, and this is Sophia. Steve invited us to give a lecture today, and we'll be talking about UI and UX design. We're going to cover things like menus, visual cues, and all sorts of stuff. At the end, we'd also like to do a little sort of workshop thing if we have time, where you basically share your games or your ideas with us, and maybe we can discuss UI and UX in the context of your games. So to give a little bit of info on who we are, we're sisters who have both finished our undergrad and master's here at UTSG in CS. We have backgrounds in HCI and game design, and we both took this course in the past and have acted as TAs for the course on a few occasions. I'm currently a first-year PhD student in CS on leave, but I'm doing some game development at the moment, and my area of research is focused on gamification narratives as well as visualization literacy.
So hi, I'm Sophia. My master's was focused on data visualization, and I'm currently working as a lab coordinator in the department, which sort of just means like I help the instructors with a bunch of stuff.
Be good or else you talk to her. Anyway,
so I guess on to more interesting things aside from us. So first off, what are UI and UX? So UI stands for user interfaces, and this is the way that users interact with your game. So broadly speaking, a good UI means that your user feels like their interactions with your game are normal, the controls all feel natural, the display on the screen doesn't feel too intrusive, all the menus feel natural and navigatable, and so on. The less players have to actually pay attention to how they interact with your game, the more immersed they'll feel. So UX, on the other hand, is user experience. While it's sort of similar, this is much more broad, and it covers the entire spectrum of how a user feels when playing your game. So all the things that make a game feel good are the results of designing for a good user experience. So for example, consider fighting games. You can make a character punch another really easily, but how do we make that feel really good? As an analogy, if you have a car, then the UI would be the controls to your car, while the UX is how the car looks and feels. There's a natural overlap, of course. If the controls feel bad, then the experience will likewise be really bad. So today's lecture talks all about UI and UX, things to keep in mind, things to pay attention to, and how to give your game a little bit of more polish so that it feels good to play. So you may be thinking, do I really need to care about UI stuff? my game doesn't have a UI. In which case, haha, yes, it does have a UI. If you didn't have one, then you would have made a movie instead. A car without controls is just a roller coaster, and a game without interactions is just a movie. So speaking of controls, how do you pick controls for your game? How people use your controller, what button mappings you use, etc. It's all an important part of the UI, since it's what people will be interacting with. It's their main way of interacting with the game and the first thing they'll come across. If the controller interactions feel awkward or clunky to them, then they'll notice and it might detract from their immersion and their gameplay. So a bit of advice, stick to familiar control schemes. If your game uses a generic controller, the buttons that are easiest to reach with your thumb are for the most commonly used commands. So this is typically like the bottom button for jumping or interactions, and the button to the right is for like the next common interaction, which sort of makes sense when you're holding the controller at rest, like your thumb sort of hovers on these. The choices you make will vary depending on your game and what you need to control, but it's sort of a good rule of thumb to look at similar games for inspiration. And if you're using other types of controls like a keyboard and mouse or Joy-Cons or something, then pay attention to how your hand is at resting state, with what buttons are sort of the easiest to reach and what sort of feels more natural. An important step for making sure you're using the right controls is to see what players instinctively move towards when they're playing your game and how fast they are actually able to pick up their controls. So for example, suppose you have an inventory in your game. How often does your player check it? If it's constant, then maybe reaching for like the top button isn't the best idea. It requires like a little bit more effort. If they rarely check it though, then the top button might be okay, or you can move it to like a less important key or hide it in a menu. It all depends on your game and the player's behavior. So at the same time, if a player has to constantly keep track of their inventory, maybe you don't want to force them to open it up every single time. For example, you might want to put their items or resources on display instead. Cool. So let's say you have like a nice and beautiful control scheme. How do you teach players to use it? So an extremely common way of creating a tutorial is to put out a lot of text, and a lot. Words are used to communicate every control, or maybe like throwing a diagram with every label or every control being labeled. So this is cool and it's like cheap and easy, but people are also really, really bad at reading. They see like giant blurbs of text and their eyes sort of just glaze over. So one suggestion is to use fewer words. And this is a picture from Untitled Goose Game. The controls are telegraphed along the top, and it's persistent so long as the character or the player isn't running. So notice how short and how concise it is. Even just seeing the B is enough to let players know that they should press B. Sometimes there's more complicated controls too. So again, for Untitled Goose Game, it explains the mechanics while also putting the controls in. Again, notice how they use like ZL and A. Even if the player doesn't read the text, they could see the buttons and they'll know that they should press it. So one other note when teaching controls to your players, don't just rely on a schematic. It's a very easy way out and it's less than helpful in teaching, and it'll probably just confuse your users a bit. Instead, it's better to introduce like one control at a time, just like Untitled Goose Game. You provide guidance of a single control. You give them a chance to rehearse the actions and familiarize themselves with it. After they're used to their new control, then you let them rehearse it in addition to any previous controls that they've used before introducing even more things. You don't have to revisit like everything you've taught them in the past every single time, but the main point is just introducing one control at a time and giving them a chance to rehearse it is super important. Okay, so maybe your players are able to figure out their controls, but they're still completely lost as to what to do. Maybe you have some glorious text that tells them exactly what they're supposed to do, but they still don't read. This is why you should also try to show them in addition to telling them. So this is one of my favorite examples of showing and telling, and it's a tutorial from MapleStory 2. Rest in peace.
Yeah, rest in peace.
So
It's no longer up.
Yeah. There's text along the top, and then there's like some glowing arrows. Even if you don't really read, you're guided to the objective, and they even label the controls when you have an interaction available to you, like pressing space. If someone wants to read the text at the top, they can. If they don't, it's still very clear where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to do. Yeah. So recapping, there's a short text description of the goal at the top. Short is sort of the keyword. There's also glowing arrows which stand out, indicating where to go. So along the ground, very noticeable. And the goal is also highlighted with like a glow and a particle effect. So it's very, very hard to get lost here. At the goal itself, the control that they need to do is shown along with like what it does. When that interaction is done, a new goal is also telegraphed.
Helping players determine where to go can extend past the tutorial as well. The amount of wandering and free exploration that's considered acceptable changes based on the type of game. So in an open world game, it might be fine to like let players just walk around on their own in leisure for a while. But what if they like keep walking around in circles, not because they want to explore, but because they're actually lost? That can be frustrating and take away from the user experience. So navigation systems can help to prevent this by giving players a helping hand whenever they need it. In this picture, you can see arrows on the ground, like guiding the player to their next destination. And note that in this game, these arrows only show up when you actually request it. It's not up all the time. This is important because you don't really want your game to feel like one giant tutorial. The key thing is that navigation systems in the main game like should serve as points of reference when players feel like looking at them. Here's another example of navigation in a game, again from MapleStory 2, rest in peace. Instead of arrows on the ground, the game has arrows on the right side over here and on the ring around the player to indicate which way to go in order to complete an objective. Again, the navigation guide can be toggled and does not have to be on all the time. So what other navigation tool can you see here?
A mini map.
Yeah, there's a mini map in the top right. Maps and mini maps are often used in order to tell players where they are in the game world. Mini maps often appear in some corner for quick reference, and icons are used to indicate the presence of objectives, structures, enemies, friendly NPCs, or other players. Maps, on the other hand, tend to take up a larger portion of the screen, if not the majority of it. You generally don't want to obstruct a player's view unless they explicitly request it via a button press or some other interaction. When players open up a map, it's because they want to see that information. Moreover, they want to see more than what's shown on their mini-map. One issue with maps occupying the screen is that it obstructs your view of everything behind it. Some games will let you modify the transparency of maps nowadays so that you can still see what's going on behind it. In Final Fantasy XIV, for example, there's a slider in the game settings to let you set the transparency from 0 to 100. When moving around, you also have the option to specify whether or not the map automatically turns transparent.
Speaking of on-screen elements, there's a heads-up display, aka the HUD. So this is anything that's displayed on your screen that isn't actually part of your game's world. So this is also a place where you can communicate controls. If you have a nice and subtle way of reminding players of controls, then you should use it. You shouldn't have to expect them to memorize your control scheme, no matter how simple it might be. So occasionally you might have multiple tools, weapons, items, or something that you want players to be able to switch between. Communicating this through the HUD might be convenient too. For example, using a trigger or an arrow to switch tools, or if you have multiple choices, displaying a radial menu. So when designing your HUD, you'll want to keep in mind like what players might want to see at a glance instead of digging through menus. What information will they need frequently? What interactions are important or what's commonly used? So sometimes you don't want to show things on your HUD because it's unimportant or it clutters your screen too much. For example, items. In Don't Starve, the inventory is displayed in the HUD because it's something that the player will want to check very frequently. In Animal Crossing, for contrast, you don't have to check your inventory constantly, so it's hidden away until it's needed. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for this. It all depends on your game and what's important to the player. Do I have to constantly keep an eye on my resources, or are my resources something that I only have to look at like every now and then? Similarly, in some games, maps are kept on the HUD, like in Mario Kart, while in others, they're hidden behind a button, like in Splatoon. In Mario Kart, you absolutely don't want to pull open a menu unless you need to take a break, while as in Splatoon, having the map open constantly would obstruct your view. While checking the map is very important, having a clear field of view is even more important. And as a general guideline, if you have an HUD, the then it should feature only the things that a player would want to check without interrupting their gameplay. For example, in Mario Kart, a player would want to know like their rank, their position relative to other players, their current item and progress. For example, like laps, and if there's a timer, then the time. And sort of the less that's displayed, the better. One other thing to keep in mind when designing an HUD, try to stick to placing elements along the edges and the corners. The center of the screen should be reserved for your game itself and its graphics, while the sides are where your eyes will go to get like the information when it's needed. Talking about HUDs, there's one super common aspect of them, which is the HP display, aka how do I display health or whatever other status I'm using. So this typically shows how many lives you have, how much damage you've taken, etc. For those of you with combat or survival in your game, if any, then you need to figure out how you're going to display this, if at all. So there are a few factors that come into play here, which is like what type of HP system do you have? Do you have like a set number of lives or a large number of hit points? Do you have another number such as a damage percentage like in Super Smash Brothers? If you have a set number of hit points or lives, then there's sort of like, what's the difference between displaying a number, using a bar, and using icon representations? What's the best option, or is there one? So an important rule of thumb in general, your players should be able to gauge how well they're surviving or doing without having to read the details. If I'm in a fast-paced game, the last thing I want to do is to pause and look at my health. For example, at a glance, this is full health. 5 out of 5. Though I don't really have to count if I don't want to, I just see like all red. If I lose 2 health, then it's still pretty obvious. It's easy to see that some damage was taken, but I still have like a majority of my health intact. In comparison, the easy way out that people tend to do is to just use numbers. So 5 out of 5 health is a bit less easy to read, but it's still sort of readable. But when you see it change to 3 out of 5, it sort of takes a moment to really notice. This wasn't too bad since it was in the middle of the screen, but like when it's in a corner of your screen, it's very hard to see and it's not very helpful at all. So let's say you have like a lot of HP that you wanted to communicate, then you could use a bar. For example, if your health was out of 1000 or something, then losing a quarter or so of your health could be shown visually like very, very easily. But perhaps like the numbers are very important to you, but as I said, text won't communicate that very well. And if the numbers really are helpful, then you can try to combine it with a bar. So having like 13,000 hearts on your screen might be difficult, but a bar that decreases is fine. The specific display you use will depend on your game and sort of like the level of granularity that's needed. As a sort of counterexample to what I just said, you can consider Super Smash Brothers, which is like just numbers, but not really. They use numbers in addition to color. So the color of your number tells you how much damage you've taken. So even if you don't look at it specifically, you can still judge how much danger you're in at a glance. The darker the number, the more damage you've taken. So both scale and colors are easy things to tell at a glance, so use them to your advantage. But Sophia, what if I don't want HUD elements? Because minimalistic UIs are a thing and they're nice. So Monster Hunter World is a good example of showing damage instead of just displaying it. In that game, the health of a monster isn't displayed. However, the indicator used is limping. How can you tell if a monster is at low health? When the strong boy becomes a limpy boy. So you can see it here. The monster is very obviously like limping away. Remember that this doesn't have to just be for your enemies. Your player itself can also like exhibit exhaustion through animations. Effects such as blood or tattered clothes could also help communicate this. In addition, you can use other effects to indicate damage, like the edges of your screen turning red. If you get hit, then a screen shake or a flash of red is also a good indicator of taking damage. And Don't Starve also uses increased contrast and changes in saturation to indicate insanity. You can get creative and keep in theme with your game, and you can communicate a bunch of different statuses in a bunch of different ways. We'll talk more about like other types of feedback later, but keep in mind the varying visual cues you can use throughout your game. So another thing that players will see and interact with are menus. So this could be your start screen, menus within your game, etc. So it's something that players will have to interact with actively as opposed to HUDs, which are a little bit more passive. So here we have two different menus, both for different Smash games. On the left of the leftmost one, there's Melee's menu, and you can see the current selection and a preview of the submenu. On the right is Smash Wii U's, which is pretty with size emphasizing what's most likely to be used. But at the same time, with the Wii U one, it's hard to tell what some of the options are or where to find certain things. For example, where's training mode? If you, for some reason, guessed games and more, good job, because I definitely rotated through like every single menu whenever I tried to look for it. When you're designing a menu, you might have to try to trade off like aesthetic appeal and functionality. If a menu is too frustrating, it'll dampen the experience. If it's too ugly, then that also ruins things. It's hard to make menus that are functional and aesthetically pleasing, but it's not impossible. So personally, I'm a fan of this menu from Persona 5 Scramble. For example, a lot of the UIs in Persona 5 match the aesthetics of the game. Maybe they're like a bit flashy or extra, but it's still fairly functional. One annoyance might be like the time in between changing menus, but if there actually was some like loading time in between it, then this animation would be like a fantastic way to mask it. What I love most about this screen in particular is like, this is the current active menu, but around the corner, you can see a preview of the submenus. As an added bonus, you can also see the current context too, which is like equip. And it's like a beautiful combination of functionality from Melee's submenus preview while incorporating the game's aesthetics. Note too, the use of the colors. There's a lot going on, but the area you're supposed to focus on is very eye-catching and colorful, and it isn't too distracting. It sticks out very nicely. So in both menus and tutorial text, you've got a lot of words, which means how you present those words is important too, begging the question, what font should I use? I'm very good at transitions. Also, I need water. Okay, so here we have two very beautiful examples of font choices. On the left, fancy text that sets the mood, but is hard to read. On the right, some of the letters are a bit hard to see, mostly along Sonic's arm, but it's in Comic Sans MS. Very fancy. So font choice is important. There's like a common and obvious design advice, which is like, don't use Comic Sans MS. It's overused and it's childish and it's tacky, but despite all of that, it has one redeeming quality, which is it's easy to read. So when you're picking fonts for the text you need in your game, make sure it's something that can be easily read. So if you just need text for like a short and infrequently read label, then you can get away with something that's a bit harder to read, but it sets the right mood. But for something like dialogue or instructions, keep it simple. Again, Persona 5 does this well. In the top left, they use like fancy text. Dialogue itself is actually very readable though. So no one really wants to read a paragraph of instructions in cursive or in fancy fonts that require like more than minimal brain power to decipher. So read the second line in particular. The F in it looks like an R and an R looks like a B. It's just difficult. So try to keep your text simple and legible. If you have to pick between a font that suits the mood and settings of your game and a font that's easy to read, I would pick the one that is easy to read. So let's say you've chosen a nice, elegant, and readable font. That's good, but it's not sufficient for legibility. So for example, this text is really hard to read. You can sort of read it, but it is difficult. Imagine if it didn't have any outlines at all and it was just like plain white text on the light background. That would be a nightmare. So consider font color as well. Legibility of that is still important. The easiest and most common ways to deal with font colors would be to either use an outline on your text, which is something that should contrast with the font color very well. For example, black around white text or the opposite way around. Or if you don't want to use an outline, then a shadow or an overlay behind your text works well too. As long as the text is visible regardless of the color of your screen, then you're okay. In a similar vein, there's the idea of like, how do you format dialogue in your game? Some of you, if you do feature dialogue, then there's a few choices that you can make. So first, there's like a fixed dialog box. Typically, this lies on either like the bottom or the top of your screen, which sort of depends on how your screen is laid out. If you tend to have important details at the top of your screen, or the player typically needs to move like upwards to progress as opposed to downwards, then you should put your dialogue at the bottom and vice versa. Since fixed dialogue boxes tend to take up more screen real estate, and it's also like a fixed area, they take up a lot of active attention and typically require your player to interact more or interact with it directly in order to continue. So an alternative is to have floating dialogue boxes. So these usually come with some sort of indicator of which character is talking and gives you a good way of locating the set character. So they use positioning to indicate who's speaking and in what order, and it can be useful when characters are talking a distance away, it can be useful when characters are talking a distance away to tell you like which direction they're located. If you have multiple characters talking and the dialogue is something that gets flipped through sort of like passively, like idle chatter, then these might be a bit better. If you do have multiple characters talking, then you should have an indication of who's speaking. And this can either be through like the use of character portraits, like in MapleStory 2, colors, or a tail that speaks to the pointer, or like some combination of all of these. Often it also helps to indicate like how to continue dialogue and show whether the player needs to interact in order to continue. For example, in the screenshot from Pokemon Emerald, there's a little red arrow that indicates that there's more that the NPC has to say. Similarly, in Rhythm Heaven Fever, the actual button to press is like shown on the screen. Note how in both of these, like the indicator is in the bottom right. For Western reading, the flow of text usually moves left to right, top to bottom, and it makes sense for us to show the button at the end of the text or where our eyes might fall after reading the message.
So how do I add personality to my game and make it interesting? In visual novels and other story-driven games, dialogue is very important in conveying information about characters in the game world. But your game doesn't have to be a visual novel in order to inject some personality into it. Don't forget that games tend to use both visual and audio stimuli to keep players engaged. In addition to sound effects and background music, you can use voiceovers or to supplement or even omit text. For some players, it can be more interesting to listen to voice cutscenes rather than reading walls of text. And there are lots of ways that you could get creative with voices as well. So in Don't Starve, characters have voices, but they're really just instrument sounds. But still, the choice of instrument will add to each character's personality. So even though you don't hear any actual words, the choice of instrument adds to how you perceive each character. You can tell that some characters sound rougher than others. There's a robot that sounds robotic, and there might be a spider that sounds more monstrous. Okay, I'll skip to the robot. You just want to see the spider.
Oh, yep.
Someone mentioned Animal Crossing, and that is indeed the next slide. So in Animal Crossing, characters have voices to simulate spoken language, but it's not really English. Different types of characters have different voices based on their personalities. And like with Don't Starve, the presence of sound is used to supplement the text that shows up on the screen. So you can see here that the emotion of characters is also further highlighted using visual effects such as dark swirls when upset or a puff of smoke when angry. Sound effects can also play on emotion changes, and the walking animation and posture of characters reflect their mood. In The Sims, characters don't really speak any discernible language, but it's still obvious what emotions they're conveying based off of the cadence, voice, and pitch cadence, tone, and pitch of their voice. So here's a clip of voice samples for those who may be unfamiliar with the game. So when designing the game, the choice to go with a fake language was actually very deliberate. Will Wright, the creator of The Sims, wanted the idea of emotions to resonate with people, but he didn't want the Sims to say anything meaningful so as to not mess with the characters' storytelling. This explains why, unlike Animal Crossing or Don't Starve, The Sims doesn't actually show any text. They want you to come up with your own stories and dialogue. So instead of text, thought bubbles with icons show up to give you a rough idea of what the characters are thinking or talking about. Sound can also be used to add personality to objects and terrains, not just characters. So I'm going to play a clip of the villager in Smash smacking his head on a bunch of different surfaces. So yeah, basically every surface sounds different depending on the type of material used. Hitting your head or running around a stone floor does not sound the same as if you were on a wooden platform or in water. So if you ever had the time, I would really recommend looking this video up and listening to it with headphones for better quality. This level of detail is amazing. And even though some people might not notice the difference in sound between different types of floors, they'll probably notice if you're running on solid ground versus on water.
So just like feedback from the environment, there's also other types of feedback you can give your player to make their experiences more satisfying. So we can talk about feedback for combat first. You can make like one character hit another, but will that feel good? Maybe, maybe not, but there are some cinematography tricks you can use to enhance the experience. So your camera is a useful tool for showing impact or powerful actions. For example, you can do zoom ins. You can also slow down your camera to show like cool effects or give players a chance to react or change their behavior. Freezing can also be used to show powerful impacts and really emphasize like a special effect. And shaking your screen can indicate like lost health or again, powerful impacts. If you want to emulate the combat of a game, watch a video of it and see like what makes the combat feel so good. The controls are one thing, but the cinematography is like another. If you happen to have like puzzles in your game, another important piece of feedback to consider is for conveying like performance or how well a player is doing. This is usually like showing whether a player is going the right way or not. How do your players know that they're progressing? Is there an indication of where they should go? If they do something right, what feedback do they get? As mentioned before, maybe small camera shakes or little jingles playing. Showing your player like what changed is also helpful, and it helps guide your player on where they should go or what changed. It's also important to show like when a player is doing something wrong, if possible. For example, like a bzz, bzz sound or like otherwise your player might keep trying to perform the same incorrect action over and over again without realizing that they're not supposed to shoot something, go to a certain place, or do like a certain action. So another really good example is Rhythm Heaven. So when something's done right here, it sounds right. So. Okay. So in this, there were like flowers that appeared when the right action was done. There was like a small facial expression change when something was like done slightly wrong. And then the frogs hopped on when something was like very, very off. If you have an interaction that fails, then like make it break the rhythm or make it sound off. Visual indicators also help further the point. If you like using text and stuff like hit or miss displays are fine, but there are also like more creative ways to illustrate success and failure.
On the topic of feedback, there are times when you need to do a lot of processing or other computations, such as when you're swapping between large scenes. So what is one way that you might mask this transition? Loading screens. Games often use loading screens as a way to mask the transition. And what do you normally see in loading screens?
Loading bars.
Yeah. So most loading screens nowadays contain some sort of animation or a loading bar to show that progress is actually being made. If you were to remove the bar, players might think that the game is frozen, so it's important to indicate that there's something going on. This applies to moments when you see the game world as well, not just in loading screens. So even when you're not actively doing anything, it's important for games to show some sort of movement so players know that their game isn't frozen. This is an example from a rhythm game. There is a few seconds of silence at the start of this particular song, but I know that this game is still running because I see a subtle character animation and a bar moving along the top. In lots of games, you'll find idle animations being used to give life to both characters and the game itself. Animations are great, but just throwing in a bunch of animations is not necessarily the way to go. If you've done a little bit of front-end development or played with CSS, you might be a bit familiar with animation curves. All of these animations share the same start and end positions as well as time, and they all follow the same path. But they make use of different animation curves, resulting in changes in how the animations actually play out. Animation curves don't have to apply specifically to animation of models. They could also be applied to things like movement as well, which is really a big part of user experience. When you say things like, I want running to feel really good, this is one way of enhancing it. When a character starts moving, you might want to ease into it, starting out like a little bit slow initially, then ramping things up, keeping a steady speed, and then easing back out as you stop running or moving. When turning characters, you might want to ease the rotation a bit as well. But be wary that if your animation is too quick, it might seem too snappy and feel choppy. But what happens when animation is too slow? Lots of research has been done on how quickly humans perceive changes in stimuli. So for example, research from U of T found that people can perceive 11 millisecond improvements to dragging interactions. And findings like these are important when trying to design zero latency systems, since zero latency doesn't necessarily mean that we need 0 millisecond response times. We just need something that's fast enough to not be noticeable. So when it comes to the use of animations in UX, animation speeds should optimally range from 200 to 500 milliseconds, and animations which occur in under 100 milliseconds are generally perceived as being instantaneous. There are lots of tips related to animations, and I'm not going to go through them all, but I highly recommend going through the page linked on this slide at the bottom here, if interested. In online games, network latency can play a big factor in user experience. For turn-based or strategy games, players may tolerate higher delays since there isn't as much of a sense of urgency. But when it comes to like fast-paced games like MOBAs, fighting games, or first-person shooters where quick reflexes are important, high latency or lag is a great way to make players upset. And it's also like the default excuse when you're doing badly, right? Lag. Anyway, so one way of mitigating the effects of lag is through prediction. In minimizing latency on digital tabletop surfaces, you can predict where a user's finger might land based on things like the trajectory of their hand and arm as it lifts up. Prediction can also be applied to network games. I don't know that much about netcode or netcode techniques, but there's some middleware called GTPO that's been made available to the public, and they do use prediction and rollbacks to try and provide low latency experiences. But animations and effects could also be used to mask network delays. So for example, when a player performs an action that requires some background calculations or a server response, we could mask that calculation time using animations. But what happens if the calculation takes a lot longer than expected? After the animation ends, do you still want to lock your player? In this example, the player presses attack. The character's attack animation starts, and when the server finally responds, the rest of the attack animation is done. And through all of that, the character is locked in place and cannot move. But what if you just let the player do the animation and they can't do anything until the animation ends? But wait, all right. But if the server doesn't respond, you're still free to move, and damage just doesn't get shown or calculated until the server responds. That is a long sentence. Anyway, that way, the player's side doesn't freeze up at all. It's just the damage that doesn't show up or update until after. Next is, how do we tell players what to look at? Sometimes there's a ton of stuff on the screen. This can lead to cognitive overload, making users feel very overwhelmed. When you design levels in a puzzle game, you don't generally give players every single ability off the bat. You usually break things apart into smaller segments so players get a chance to slowly learn about things. This approach should also be applied to UI and UX design as well. In Civilization 5, for example, clouds will cover everything except for what you've already explored, and the minimap reflects this. This forcibly restricts the players to focus on whatever has already been revealed to them. Aside from hiding things, you can draw player focus by playing with lighting. In this screenshot, the focus is on the tiles related to Venice. Venice. It's obvious what's considered a part of Venice and what isn't, based off what's lit up and what's in the shadows. Lighting is typically a very good way of guiding players in general. If everything's dark except for one spot, players will inherently understand that they should be moving to the giant bright spot. So if you think about like save points in RPGs, they typically make use of very shiny lights to give players a sense of safety. The opposite is true. You can use shadows and darkness to convey danger. And besides lighting, you could also use other things like color or texture. So for example, visual indicators for AoE attacks in games can help users understand what areas to avoid. That's some good quality. You can see like it was orange over there, and then the boss attacked that area, and the character knew to run out of that area before it goes off. In Pokemon, tall grass is used to indicate where you'll run into wild encounters. If you're walking around in regular grass, like in the top, you will be safe from wild Pidgeys. Even without color or lighting, the distinction between tall grass and not tall grass is obvious. And when translated into 3D, you can see how tall grass stands out. That said, keep in mind that if you teach players that a color, texture, or some sort of structure is associated with something, for example, starting a battle or unlocking a door, make sure that this visual indicator is never used for anything else. You want to maintain an almost one-to-one mapping of interactions or effects to visual accents in order to minimize player confusion. Contrast could also be used to help draw attention to things. So like in a bunch of older cartoons, you could tell which part of a scene was active and is going to move. And you can use this as a technique in games as well. Like here I have a still from Tom and Jerry. If you look closely, you can see a difference between dynamic and static items in the picture. Active items in older cartoons tended to have fewer details like shadows or lighting. So there are 3 items or groups of items in this picture that are animated. Can you tell what they are?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Yes, see also Cuphead. Here's another example, also from Tom and Jerry. Here you can obviously tell that Tom is a dynamic animated component, but this bubblegum dispenser thingy is also considerably less detailed than the bucket of paste. Wow. So if you want something to stand out, change its surroundings so that the background objects are more dull or boring to look at. Make it so that it seriously looks like it's just the background. Conversely, this also means that if you want players to know something, if you want players to know something can be interacted with, you need to make sure it doesn't blend into the background. Make use of more muted colors for background details, and then take advantage of high contrast to get players to focus on things. So another way to draw attention to something is to point it out. Here's a short clip on awareness to wrap up this section.
This is an awareness test. The answer is 30. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So you can also use like colors and contrast to guide what your players see, but you also have to take into consideration like how you design your camera and what's actually in their field of view. So let's talk about cameras briefly. This is how your player sees parts of your games, and it comes with a few of its own challenges. So for example, like there's some cool things you can do with your camera, like using your camera to increase your game's difficulty. Volume loud. Wow. Yeah, so just kidding. This is like a horrible, horrible camera. So occlusion is something that you need to keep in mind for your games. If you're using a third person perspective, how do you handle obstacles between your player and the camera? Does your camera like move around the obstacle, or does the obstacle become translucent or transparent? If you choose to move your camera around the obstacle, make sure this doesn't happen constantly. Otherwise, you risk like motion sickness, and it also might annoy your player. So hiding the obstacle is a pretty safe method, but it all sort of depends on your game and what you can or can't hide. So this is also an option, which is like cutting through walls like in The Sims. This way you get the information that there is a wall there, but the wall itself isn't obstructing anything. For cameras in particular, play test them. If your camera moves and rotates a lot, you'll want to pay a lot of attention to motion sickness. This is especially the case for first-person cameras or anything that follows a person's movements down to like the very last bounce. Personally, both of us get like motion sick really easily. So if you're worried and need like play testing for first-person cameras, we're probably good test subjects.
There might be a lot going on in your game, but your camera can only show you so much. So one way of telling players that something exists in an area that they don't see is through icons on a mini map, but not every game needs a map. One thing that you could do is play with the music. When you're in an enemy's line of sight or in a dangerous position, for example, there could be a change in music or some other audio cue. That said, audio cues might not be enough on their own. Taking advantage of both visual and auditory channels would be much better. In Mario Kart, you can see incoming danger through the presence of icons on the screen. Here you can see a red shell coming for you, along with 2 players with the star effect activated. The position of the icon shows you where each item or character is relative to your position, and this gives you a chance to anticipate what's coming. If you need inspiration for handling off-screen events, first-person shooters are probably a very good source of information because players need to be aware of what's going on around them even if they can't see it. and many FPS games combine visual indicators with directional sound to let players know what's happening. So here's an example of how sound can be used to understand where sources of danger are. So no fancy segue into this topic or anything, but I think it's worth talking about in the context of UI and UX design. Weird visual effects can actually happen based on what you display and how you position elements. For example, the Herman grid is just a bunch of black squares with white lines, but you might actually perceive gray spots at various intersections, even though they aren't actually there. And as you decrease the squares, this effect diminishes. Another thing to be aware of is simultaneous contrast. Here we have a single gray rectangle. When I slap it on top of a gradient going from dark gray to a lighter gray, you might perceive the original rectangle to now be a gradient in the opposite direction. That is, from left to right, it might look like it's getting progressively darker. Wow, magic. But the inner rectangle is really only a single shade of gray. You're just perceiving it differently because of the contrast with its surroundings. Another example is the Kafka ring. Here we have a gray donut thingy on top of two rectangles. When you split it apart, the right side of the donut looks a little bit darker than the left side due to the background of each item. And this effect is made greater when you put the halves together like this. Your mind tends to group things together and maintain flow. And here the right half of the ring appears darker because your mind is trying to perceive it as a continuation of the black background on the left. The Kafka ring is an example shown in gestalt psychology, which tries to explain how we perceive things in the chaotic world, such as how we tend to group things and then perceive them as a whole, perceive the whole as something other than just the sum of its parts. So, what do you see in this picture? Do you view units here as 6 groups or 16 individuals, or maybe 2 large groups split into 6 subgroups? With the law of proximity, we automatically group things based on how close they are to each other. So here you might see 6 groups of people. In this particular game, each group is treated as 1 unit. So all individual characters you see in a group share 1 collective health bar, and it makes logical sense to players. And what do you see here? How do you know that there are 2 groups? The law of proximity takes effect here, dividing them into groups on the left and on the right, but there are also similarities in their visual designs. The law of similarity then is pretty obvious. Things that look visually similar are treated as being part of a group. So back to this example, you could see 6 groups based on proximity, 2 groups based on the style of their outfits, or maybe 3 groups based on whether they're mounted, dismounted, or accompanying a big cannon thingy. As an aside, these principles can be applied to things like menu designs as well. So here's a status screen from a game. Notice how groups of interactable elements are visually similar to one another. The icons at the top share a similar artistic design, while character info is presented very differently, like in the form of very large vertical portraits and some text on top. You can also see that the law of proximity in play here. Interactable elements are grouped together horizontally. In the bottom, you can tell which button icon is attributed to each piece of text. This is because it follows an obvious pattern, like over here, button, text, button, text, button, text, but also because there's like a little bit of spacing used to split the groups apart. There are other ways of grouping things as well. With the law of closure, our mind likes to fill in gaps. In continuity, we tend to follow a smooth curve as opposed to suddenly changing direction. In the law of common fate, things that move together tend to be grouped together. So in real life, for example, if you see 18 birds moving in the same direction, you don't normally think about there being 18 birds, you view them as a single flock. So how can you figure out which bird represents the player? So when the player is slightly out of sync, it becomes a bit more obvious. All NPCs move together in the same beat. It also helps that the main character is kind of in the middle of the screen. Finally, a few notes about things to keep in mind. Please try to avoid switching between red and green to indicate important things like status changes. Red-green color blindness, as well as other forms of color blindness, are things you should be mindful of. Someone with color blindness will have difficulty differentiating between some colors. And if color is the only thing that you have to signify change in something in your game, you might be giving your players a hard time. So to get around this, you could use different color combinations like blue and orange, or add secondary indicators of change such as size or texture. And you could also play around with brightness. So as a small activity, I think red and blue is okay. Yeah. I'm going to show you pairs of colors. And for each pair, I want you to, I guess, send me the clap emote if you think that the colors are different. And please don't give in to peer pressure. Okay. So here's the first pair. Please send me the clap if you think that they are different. Okay, hands down. How do you unhand? How do you unclap? Wait, they're doing it. They got it.
Yeah,
All
unclap.
right. Zoom pros. Okay. Please clap if you think they're different.
Oh, it's a timer.
Oh. Okay. And one more time. I'm gonna wait for the claps to time out. Please clap if you think they're different. Okay, so for all three cases, the colors were different, but some differences were generally more difficult to perceive than others. Tiny, tiny changes in brightness is not generally useful. And some people are really good at perceiving minor changes in brightness, while others require slightly more drastic changes before they notice them. I used gray in the previous examples, but brightness perception might vary across different hues. For some, it might be easier to detect minor differences between shades of blue versus shades of red. I'm good with red, but I stink at blue.
I'm the opposite.
Wow, cool. So one of the last things we wanted to show is an example of how visuals and sound can come together to bolster user experience. I want you to watch and listen to how things build up over time and how the audio is dynamic and reacts to user input. I need to swap tabs for this. Wow. Oh no. Okay.
Yep, Tetris effect.
I guess we could just talk about this one as well. There's a cool website that gives you a good example of really bad user interface. I'll just show you it really briefly. If you want to try it out yourself, the link is userinyourface.com. Whoa, technology. Wow. So yeah, it starts by like asking you to fill out a form as fast and as accurate as possible. So when you normally see this, you might be inclined to go for the big green button, but no, it's like click
Here. Click
here,
here.
click here, the word here. All right. I give up. No. Okay. And then here's another example of a really bad UI. Unfortunately, they have actually updated this website, so this version no longer exists. But we're gonna archive it here in this slide forever. So Unity without UI? No, thank you. Wow. All right. So with what time we have left, we'd like to like pass this over to you guys. What are your games like? And is there anything you have or you'd like our opinion or feedback on? Now would also be like a good time to get feedback from us on your games or your ideas and your fellow students. Like we could also talk about how UI and UX might like fit into your game or how you might style it. That is the end of our presentation officially.
Well, let's start off by asking about your game. Do you remember your game back when you were doing this in 2016?
Yes.
What was your game back then?
It was Prominence.
Prominence,
Yeah,
yeah.
we had a game where you
There was a stealth game. It was sort of a stealth game. There was a character that moved back and forth, and you have to sort of just get around them to get to your goal.
Hmm.
And you can blend in with the environment by matching colors with it in order to progress.
Hmm.
So I don't think we have any pictures of it, but our main thing that we needed to telegraph was like what the enemy is able to see. So we had like a little vision cone beneath them to sort of telegraph like what they can actually see and what they can't, where safe places are. And you can tell if you're hidden because you would actually blend in with the scenery. Something like that.
How about like
trying to see if I have it still.
how would like the UI also being able to say like communicate to the player what things they're able to blend in with?
So that was just through color and actually through placement. Anything that was like on the game level.
Mhm.
I think that was just mine. Oh no, that animation's gone by now.
That's okay.
No.
That's okay. I mean,
Can
yeah, I only mention it because it's nice. It's nice to remind people that you actually took this course and that some of the decisions that people are going through right now are the same ones you went through back then. You know, but now you're just older and wiser and have a master's degree in HCI to help kind of bolster your skills.
I can't find the game, but I did find our very, very old design doc.
Wow.
Hopefully it'll load.
I don't remember what it looks like. This could be either really good or really bad.
Well, in the meantime, there is a question on the chat.
Oh,
Yep, from Zuhab. So he's saying that their game has two worlds, a regular and reflected world. Basically, they have a mirror that allows you to kind of switch back and forth between them. And they're thinking of using color palettes to differentiate which world you're in. So, yeah. So they're saying,
besides color, you could probably play with sound. Like
A reflected thing might have like a little, the reflective world might be like a little more echoey.
mhm,
Like if you're in like a hall of mirrors, or there might be like, I want to say maybe even a small shimmer effect or like texture map on things.
I think one of the things they're doing is it's a little bit more story-based. So they're trying to make it clear what elements are interactable and what aren't. So you mentioned a couple of things, right? Like making sure that the background is kind of a different resolution or a different palette, or, you know, like has a different level of detail than the things that are interactable.
Yeah. I think another way is you could have like outlines around interactable objects.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that idea about the ambience white noise could be good. Another one, if you don't want it to be like,
So cell shaded almost.
yeah, I think like a really interesting one is if you have the regular world have a clear like motif in the music, and then you like make a riff on that, or you like remix it a bit for the reflected world, even.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, or vice versa. So you can kind of tell it's still like the same theme, but it's still not. I don't know. Yeah, it's the same but different.
Yeah. Because I know some things that people have done in the past, sometimes they'll do the cell shading to be able to really draw boundaries around stuff. And like, it's just something you can turn on when you're rendering your object, is just make some things cell shaded. Yeah, there's the definition, like, you know, the detail, like having the background be a little more washed out than the interactable objects. Having them glow as you get closer to them, having them be like a different brightness level.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think what other tricks people have used in the past to make this happen.
Definitely glows and particle effects are like two very common ones to go with, I think.
Oh yeah, particle effects, right? Like having the thing almost
Unity
like
has a
give off.
built-in particle effect, so you guys could use that.
Mhm. Yeah. Because yeah, like in order to try to make the background seem more vivid and lifelike, they need to also make sure that people know which objects are part of the environment. You know, like what's just decoration and what's actually interactable.
Mhm.
Let's see.
Chicken voice acting for our game. Oh,
Yeah, that's one where, you know, they've got potions around. And so every time you run into a potion, then it transforms you into a type of creature. And so that affects the movement and how your character can get through the level. So one of them's supposed to be a chicken. So yeah. Yeah, it's like 2016. This is like 6 years ago.
My God.
I know.
What do we mean by particle effects?
So like little glowing specks or like,
You know, like groups of fireflies, kind of. Those could be viewed as particle effects almost. Basically, you set like a source point where the particles will be
Right.
generated from, and then you have like little balls of light or sparkly things that like float away from this point. And Unity does have a built-in particle effect system or engine that you could add to your game if it's in 3D.
So basically, it'll just generate particles, and the particles will have a certain like luminescence, and they'll have a certain movement to them.
You can like change a bunch of things, like what each particle looks like, the color, how fast things are generated, the size of them. Yeah, all sorts of things.
I guess the thing about a glow is that a glow is nice, but it's also kind of static. Whereas like the particle effects really draw people's attention to it because it's like a glow that's kind of moving and active. Trying to think of, I mean, I know that Pitfall Planet did that when they were doing their games, but I'm trying to think of what's like a more mainstream game that shows particle effects, and where it's like you remember, if you know the game, you're like, oh yeah, that's got particle effects to it. Like, you know, like the Fable series, you know, they used to have things where they'd be glowing, or anytime you're supposed to have like a power up or something that you pick up, you know, where something like a creature has dropped something and you're meant to pick it up, you know, it'll either be like glowing or particly. Press F to teleport every time the user looks in the mirror.
If it is not a very, like, if it doesn't take a sizable chunk of screen real estate, I think it's fine to actually keep that message every time they look at the mirror.
yeah. If you don't want like the whole message to, you could just have like F inside of like as a key, and then beside that teleport. That way it's even shorter, less to read.
Yeah, I agree. The F teleport.
Yep.
Is good. Yeah, because they're not going to be playing it for that long. So having that reminder is a nice courtesy, right? If someone's been playing this game for an hour, then yeah, maybe you don't need to have it on every time. How do you convey something is interactable, but currently the user is not close enough? Oh, interesting. Yep. All right. So something is interactable, but you can't interact with it yet because you're not close enough. What would you do?
That would depend on the style of your game. You can either show it in changes to the model itself, like if you have a door, for example, if you were to slap chains on it, that would convey that it is locked, right? That's one way. Another way is to have something in the, like, I guess, an icon over it. Like if you were to move towards this door, you get a little like speech bubble thingy that like says, that shows a key icon or it's crossed out or something that could also convey that it's locked.
If the user is not close enough, depending on how you show that it's interactable in the first place, it could be like not active until then. So for example, player is far away, there might not be, or there might be like a small outline, but when they're actually like close enough to it, it becomes like a very solid or like more noticeable outline. Then they'll probably learn that mapping pretty fast. Alternatively, like the control showing up when they're close enough to use it.
There's also something you could like approach from a level design standpoint. Like if at the start of the level you present to them a door and then they try to interact with it because it's the first thing they see, but they see that they can't open it, then they know that they need to spend some time finding some other object or something to open up that door.
I would imagine if it's like the mirror, like just as an example, because I don't know that's exactly it. Because if it's like the mirror and you see that it's kind of glowing faintly, but you're not close enough to it, as soon as you do get close enough to it, then it could have the little thing that says F, interact, or F teleport, right? So that the prompt doesn't show up until you get within range. You could even have something that almost transforms it, right? So when you get close enough, suddenly this big like whoosh happens and the thing ends up having like this halo that kind of pops out of it. Something that really indicates like now you are close enough for this thing to be interactable. A box on a high shelf that's out of reach.
Oh, you can use do the opposite. If they're near the shelf and they have the interaction available, but they aren't like close enough, then if they try to do the interaction, you can do like a small like shake effect or like animation that of the character like trying to jump and reach or something, but not quite reaching it.
Yeah, I like that. You can even, I guess you could even have a message that says, it's too far away.
Yeah.
But that's always breaking the immersion a little bit. Like the less text that you have, the better. Which other games do when they do that little thing where you can see the hands reaching out and the character looks like they're jumping but they can't reach it. Or like, but yeah, it's
Are you able to add like, is text a part? Would it like fit the game world? Like, can your character think or say something? Because like if you try to interact with the box while it's far away, it could be like, this thing seems a bit too far.
I can't reach it.
Yeah, I can't reach it.
The idea also of your level design kind of conveying that, right? Like if it's way high up, then you could be standing there right next to the wall, but it would be too high up for it to even conceivably be reachable. Bryn was talking about this in terms of making walls communicate whether they're scalable or not, saying that there's a certain range where like walls under like 4 feet are scalable. And so you don't have any 5 feet walls because then people might not be able to tell. So you basically say anything that's not 4 feet is like 8 feet. So that, there's no question of whether there's like this height is scalable. It's, it's very much in like a quantum level. But yeah, so a bullet hell game is played from first person perspective when we're thinking of using using an indicator on the bottom left of the screen to show how close the player is to nearby bullets. This was actually one of the questions that came up, is that the one where the speed of the world is proportional to your health. So as your health goes down, everything slows down. So what they wanted to try to communicate was how close a bullet is to hitting you. So like, because if it's really slow, you could do like the Matrix thing and like step around the bullets, but you have to know how close they are to know if you're close to getting hit, which in first person games is always hard.
I my default answer for that would be to play with spatial sound. That's probably the gut instinct.
I think the other thing for me would be like some indicator like glow or something on the very like sides of your screen, like peripheral vision. Because
Right.
if it's in first person and you see something on like one side, then you'll know like, hey, I should look over at that side. It can be like a really emphasized glow, I guess.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm also thinking whenever you're playing first person shooter and someone's like shooting you, it gives that little like red crescent,
Yeah.
that kind of indicates when something is close by. So you could have something that's kind of like that, but more like a red sort of hazy glow on the side that's currently being threatened, or even like that's the triangle, like with a yellow triangle with the exclamation mark in it, that indicates that something is bad, and like having that kind of have like a little arrow in a direction so that you know that there's something that's about to hit you and to look in that direction before it hits you. But being shot from behind is definitely hard in that way. But yeah, it's kind of like that, right? Like every time you see, when they were showing the Mario Kart example, when there was a player coming up from behind you, like they showed almost like the little circle and kind of where relative to you on the bottom edge the players were, as they were approaching. You could have
Mhm.
something like that, but something that kind of conveys the feeling of alarm a little more.
In like some games, they'll have some sort of indicator at the top here. It's almost like a compass kind of, and icons can grow bigger or smaller based on how far it is. But you could also like add an arrow or something to indicate to the player that it's out of your field of view at the moment, and then you would know that you have to turn. But I guess in the context of a bullet hell game, that might be a bit difficult to follow, but that's just one way of possibly handling it.
Yeah, I like the Mario Kart indicators because if you're in a bullet hell game and suddenly like you're surrounded by these things, you'll just have nothing but these little alarm sounds, like saying you've got bullets everywhere. Let's see. Our team is heavily limited on 3D stuff, so animations might be an issue. How do you think you can transport through mirrors in a way that won't break the immersion? Thoughts?
I think blinking is actually a very good solution to that. It's like work smarter, not harder, right?
I think
How
there
would
are
you-
camera effects for like motion blur too, like a zoom in effect and then rotating. I don't know.
I like the zoom in effect too, like where you pause and then it just suddenly like zooms in huge and then it blink and then you wake up and you're on the other side. Because I think, what would it be like to be transported through a mirror? What would that look like?
Even if you're limited in terms of animations, you could simulate like the zoominess with like white lines as an overlay on your camera, right?
Mhm.
You could do some really basic code to like alternate between, I don't know, like sets of white lines to simulate any animation almost.
Yeah, there's so many things you could do.
I think there's like also the Paper Mario way where you take the screen and then you do like the whole screen flips, like flip side and stuff, or Super Paper Mario, I think it was. I don't remember.
Or some sort of like screen effect, like for example, like a mirror breaking kind of effect is one thing that could be done.
Oh yeah, like the fracture, right?
Yep.
Like the cracks in the glass kind of
Yep.
thing. And then
Yeah, exactly.
I was thinking also like there's like that, like the tie-dye effect, where like the whole screen kind of gets swirly for a bit and
Yep.
then like unswirls and you're back on the other side. Yeah, this is where I don't know like the wealth of things that you can do in Unity. Like these particular visual effects, I'd have to look them up. Or
If it's the screen flip thing, then I think in Unity that would be somewhat simple because you have your camera and you can just tell them like flip it or like change the rotation or whatever.
Yeah, like you could just take control of the camera and then have it go through a set motion every time you hit the screen or every time you teleport.
Yep.
So basically it just zooms into, like it moves the camera into the mirror and then like turns it around.
Things are cliche because they're good, right?
They make sense. They're like recognized mappings.
And that means that you're taking advantage of something that's already like been imprinted in somebody's mind and you're taking advantage of it. It's way harder to teach them something new than to invoke something they already know. So
Ropes are really good. Okay. So I guess, yeah, once you choose a platformer, then there's certain rules that you adhere to, but the benefits are that you, like the player automatically knows then some of the rules without you having to teach it.
Mhm.
This is fun. Does anyone else have a game or like a thought on how you're going to communicate certain parts of your game to your player? Let me see. I'm trying to think of, I mean, the game that comes to mind, like okay, the bullet hell game. Okay, we talked about that. Talked about the reflection game. The one where, like the Weeping Angels game is going to be tricky because you have this like this creature, and as long as you look at the creature, then it doesn't move. But as soon as you look away, then it starts coming closer to you, and you have to convey that. Like, how do you convey the distance when you're not looking at it?
Sound. I just keep thinking about like Mario in the old games where you have to like look at Boo and stuff. But
Right. But this one's like you need to know exactly how far away it is.
it depends on what it looks like essentially. If it's like a statue that's sliding, then a sound getting louder, like the sliding
like you would
sound.
hear it. Yeah.
Yep.
Is this also in like first person perspective or is it like
I think so.
isometric or okay.
Yep.
Yep, heartbeat is definitely one thing. If like
That's
Dead
true,
by
right?
Daylight, you can tell something is near you.
Well, before we get to
Look at your
Jackson's, what's a visual way of communicating how close something is without actually seeing it? Because the people may not have directional sound, so they may not know which way to look. If
Could
they
be a
hear,
shadow, like a very dramatized shadow, depending on how close it is to you.
Could be like a glow in a specific area in your screen.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, those are like the saturation.
Yeah,
That doesn't give like directional sense, but
all the static.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Right. The static has almost become something of a cliche now too.
Someone asked if they could verbalize their question.
Yes, Jackson, go
You are
ahead.
always welcome to.
Yeah, so can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So in our game is where it's mostly a first-person puzzle game where you take individual rooms, can kind of mix and match, combine them, and rotate them. In our game, some objects are like you can like pick them up and like take them with you. While as other objects, you kind of pick them up and they go directly to your inventory. So I guess how should we distinguish those two interactions? Because I think intuitively, most people are used to kind of just mouse clicking an object and then, dragging it along and pulling it wherever they need to bring the object. Whereas like putting something in an inventory, like they might press like E or something. Like, is there, I don't know if there's any other way or if I'm missing something.
You could use the same button in both cases, but you just visually show that the character's carrying something instead of having the item magically disappear into your inventory, right?
Yeah, that would probably be my instinct, like same interaction for both, but for items that don't go in your inventory, maybe make them very big. So it's like, yeah, there's no way this will fit in my pocket.
So using the same button there, that wouldn't be, I guess, confusing for the players. I guess that
Yep.
was my main concern.
To me, it would sort of just be like for my mapping internally, it sounds like just an interact button. And that interact
Right.
button is like pull or take or something like that.
Yeah, like you
Okay.
would use the same button to like talk to an NPC as you would to like,
Pick up
maybe
an
pick
item.
up an item, and that's fine because it's just the interact button in a way. It's not necessarily
it.
the talk to an NPC button.
Okay, and then one of our, I guess, our main mechanic is that they have a blueprint, and in the blueprint is where they actually do the whole room rotations and combining the rooms. So currently, like if they hover their mouse over a room and press a certain key, the room rotates. And if they, drag a room close to another room, it kind of just automatically clicks and joins together. I was thinking, how would we, because sometimes they want to, pull the, like if I join two rooms together, now that they're joined, you have the option of kind of separating them again, or you have the option of, pulling these two rooms as if they were one object. So how do you distinguish of a players, with their mouse dragging the rooms around? Do they want to separate the two rooms again, or do they just want to drag the two rooms as if they were one object?
I think when you mouse over it, or like when you click on it, you might have some prompts that ask them to select a key to say if you want to like separate or if you want to rotate. And then by default, you would treat them as a group.
I think my first instinct was something different where it's like if you just click and then move it, then it's treating it as a group. But if you click and hold on to it, there might be like a small shaking for like that room. And then after a while, it will disconnect. That
You
was
don't
my
even need
okay.
the shake. You could
Well,
just do
yeah.
it instant, but that's the
No.
same idea.
What? No,
By
not
default,
instant.
you treat them as the same group.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the
But
same.
not just not using like different keys or a key prompt.
No, but you said like you would click a key
No,
to treat it to like split it, right?
no,
What? Okay.
you hold it.
Okay.
So you click,
Either way,
drag
you're
around,
stuck.
it's a
You're
group.
clicking something.
click and hold, and then after a while, disconnect.
I guess the point is, yeah, you could click and hold, you could double click. There's ways that you can use like a single click to be able to, or like the mouse to be able to communicate different things depending on how you press or release the mouse key. But I don't know, it's tricky, right? Because you'd have to actually play it, and then as people are playtesting it, ask them what they wish they could do. Or usually what we say is, you say, okay, let's say you have the ability to click one of these blocks and move it versus clicking the group and moving it. How do you think you would click on a single block to move it? How do you think you would click on the entire group? And then just see what people do naturally. Often when you don't make an interface and then force people into it, you sometimes find out what their natural predilections are, and then you make your interface around that. So we'll basically say things like, oh, what button do you think you need to press in order to interact with this thing? And then you say like, oh, okay, everyone seems to push this button, so that's now our interact button.
Right.
Another
thank you.
thing, if you wanted to treat the single room as the default target, then you could also like highlight and select multiple if you want to specify you're working with a group of objects, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like you just draw a rectangle, and that's just like the select tool in Photoshop or
The
Paint or
Sims.
whatever, The Sims. Yeah.
Any tips on displaying how fast the game can get?
Music.
Music, yeah, right. Like it goes, the speed of the music goes faster as the speed of the objects goes faster. And luckily, every group has at least one person, one person from the faculty of music in them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What how else could
It
you
would
do?
be like a meter is a really tacky way, right? Like in
Yeah.
racing games, you can see how fast.
Or just like the bar at the top, and then when you're at like max speed, it's like shh.
You could draw speed lines on the bullets.
Yeah.
Right, so that they're longer if they're going faster.
Mhm.
I wonder if you could use particle effects for that too.
Are you able to
think
like
so. I-
change the color of the bullets? Like you could maybe link color or texture with speed as well. Is one way. But I guess that depends on what your game looks like.
It's true. You can make the resolution on the bullets like a pattern that blurs as the game goes faster. Right? So it conveys the sense of speed, even if all you're doing is changing the texture.
Oh yeah, distortion, like stretch and squish and stuff. You can use that to to communicate speed as well. Like when it's going really fast, it stretches a bit more.
Mhm. It's funny when you're playing racing games, they only ever render that middle rectangle in the screen because they say that the stuff that's going past you on the outside is going so fast that they just put it at a lower resolution. And it's almost synonymous with it being like blurry because it's going by you so quickly. So it's just one of the ways that they would cheat in the past when they had, you know, like a limited processing speed. They would only render like in high resolution the stuff that's in the middle.
Music making apps. I have no idea about music stuff.
Yeah, that's why we have a music prof who, Mondays. Just looking at one of the other questions. So since our game will have a narrative element, we're thinking of adding a journal of notes that you collect to give you hints on the puzzles and story. For those letters, we're thinking of using the UI and have voice lines to voice it out. UI wise, what would be a nice way to display these pages of notes separate from the inventory?
You can have the inventory and then you just show the button or whatever.
Mhm.
Or it could always be an item in your inventory, like a key item. That's an option as well.
I think it also depends on how long the notes are. Like if it's like a full page of text, then they'll probably have to look at it in the inventory anyways. An alternative could be like if you have a summary, like a notepad with just the key points, so that they don't have to read everything.
Yeah, it could
There
even
would-
be part of your HUD, right?
Yeah.
Like as you're playing in the bottom corner, you have something that looks like a sheaf of notes, and you click on it in order to like review some of the things you found. Like, so it's not like, so you have your inventory and then you have your journal, and they're two different things. I wonder if you could have something that's context sensitive. So as you get close to an object that you're meant to interact with according to the journal's notes, that, the journal kind of pops up and says,
Or
"Hey,
like
look at me."
shakes a bit even. Yeah.
So it's like, pulsing a little bit. Just be like, hello, there's a clue here.
It's clippy.
Yeah. I'm thinking, how do they do it in Phoenix Wright? Because that's a game that's very much about, you collect the notes and you have to be able to go back over them to remember what's important and what's not. But I don't remember if they do anything specific to, like, to draw attention to a particular clue.
I don't think they did anything particular or to emphasize one thing over another in Phoenix, right? They sort
Yeah.
of have to sift through everything.
I know, it's kind of frustrating.
I know that when you like interact with something and that leads to the clue, they would like play a sound effect or a character would respond accordingly. But like visual distinctions of things, I don't recall.
There's one game on my mind that has a journal, but I can't think of the name of it.
Wow.
It has to do with demons and stuff. Has
I think so many games have journals, right? Like
yeah.
Resident Evil, you pick up all these pages that help describe what's going on, almost any any kind of like thriller horror game has it. I mean, personally, I would make the journal almost like a side character, right? Like something that will actually like actively seek your attention when there's something that's useful for you to know, like Mimir from God of War. I'm trying to remember. I remember playing God of War. I've played a lot of God of War. I don't remember anything other than Kratos' death, I think back. Oh, okay. I remember the old school version.
Phasmophobia?
No.
Okay.
I mean, Phasmophobia has a journal too, but it's different. It's a story-based game, but it's puzzle focused.
It's puzzle focused. I'm thinking of the little, like, almost even the little fairy characters that you got in things like Okami and,
Navi.
Navi,
Zelda.
yeah.
Yeah.
The Legend of Zelda.
Right, so it wasn't as much a journal as it was like an actual character that would tell you that something is important or remind you that this is how you're meant to interact with this. That might be going a little bit too far though, in terms of what you've got capacity to implement. But certainly something that's a little bit more active than just a journal, something that actually tells you to do something as opposed to just hoping that you'll remember. You're still trying to look up this game, aren't you? What other games have we not talked about? We talked about the Untitled Puzzle game, talked about Reflection. Talk about Fool's Run a little bit, and Guardians of the Za. And and of course, there's two kids stacked on top of each other in a trench coat pretending to be an adult. But I guess the UI elements there are, like, it's not as big as some of what the other games need to do. Yeah, for that one, it's like the UX, like the experience of having these two kids trying to navigate through an environment together while making sure not to topple over as one of them standing on top of the other. That one, I feel like if there's anyone from that group here, you should really get in touch with Elaine and Sophia after this to get that feel down, because what was the slide? You had that slide that was showing the movement, right? I can't remember what the title was for that, but it's good to have that kind of like the movement graph when you're trying to create this sensation of like wobbling and almost falling over. Are you two on our Discord? I think you are, right?
Not
Not
in
this
this year's
semester.
Discord.
Oh, not in this year's. Okay. Well,
We've been omitted from the Cool Kids Club.
sorry. I will add you. Yeah, so if you had a specific question, you could reach out afterwards. Yeah, what was the name of the movement graphs?
The animation curves?
Yeah, the
Animation
animation curves.
Thank you.
Zoom. You should cite your sources, unlike me, who forgot to cite her source. But they are called animation curves.
A few things where I was trying to figure out, what the game was that you were sampling from. Like the one where you had the, there was like the knights and then the people on horseback, and you're trying to say, are they 16 individuals or?
Oh.
I was like, I feel like that's one of the Civilization games, but I couldn't figure out who would be like like shirtless with a top hat.
Oh, it's near the bottom.
Which one was this?
I want to say that is Civ, but maybe Civ 6.
Okay. Sophia, I invited you. Trying to figure out what some means.
Accessibility options and settings. Do you have to have a lot of customizability? Maybe. I think the main things are usually like font size and audio customizations. And then, if possible, contrast. I don't remember. Font size is usually the big one.
In a complete game, yes, you should have a lot of customizability. But given the scope of your game and that you're a one semester project, perhaps it's not the best use of time to try and cram in a ton of customizability right now. But if you were to pursue this after the lifespan of this course or this one term, then I think it would be worth looking into.
Yeah, so which game is this? Is Is this Civ?
Oh, this, I think
Yeah.
it's Civ 6.
So what's the, where are the people like the shirtless people with top hats? What country are they supposed to be?
I'm not good at geography.
It's a weird country. Okay, so I've added both of you.
What? That's Canada?
I've added both of you to our Discord page. So if you did have a question after this that you wanted to reach out, they will hopefully both be on it and able to answer some of your questions. With that though, because we're getting close to the end of our time, I guess I just wanted to say thank you to both of you for coming by and sharing your time and your expertise with us. Is there any last minute bits of advice you have for everybody before they go into their big development push? Anything?
Don't underestimate how much time UI and UX takes. Like, it takes a long time.
For the reset question, I'd say just give them an option to reset whenever they want. That way, if they feel too stuck, then the normal thing to do is just restart and try again from scratch. But anyways, that's for advice. Yeah, manage your time very well. Make sure you have deadlines for yourself and your group that are like 2 or 3 days ahead of the actual course deadline, because you are going to push past that, whatever you set for yourself. You'll need the spare time.
You might have to debug on the day that you have to present something, Things always break when you show it to other people.
Yep.
Don't merge things in last minute, because you might have merge conflicts that will cause you.
Yeah, not from experience or anything, right? No way.
Yeah.
I'd also say we're going to talk a little bit more about this on Thursday, but yeah, there's this idea that you have to, like, the biggest difficulty over the next 2 weeks is just putting your plan together to make sure that everything comes together in time.
One thing for level design, I think making a lot of small tutorial levels and then like one larger level is a lot better than just trying to have like 1 or 2 like very big levels planned out. Because if you do small levels, then it's easier to treat them as like both standalone levels and tutorials. Small things are good. It makes you feel like you have more to do too.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Elaine and Sophia. On behalf of the class, we very much appreciate you coming by and spending this time with us. And yes, we'll ask people to reach out to you if there's any, like pressing UI UX questions that they need help resolving.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you so much. And yes, hopefully we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Clap emojis. Clap.